Forget everything you think you know about Theodore Roosevelt. While history books highlight his White House years, they've largely ignored his most thrilling exploits, a life dedicated to scientific discovery and daring expeditions into the untamed wilderness. This isn't just about a president. It's about a relentless explorer who pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Picture Roosevelt in 1901, hand on a Bible, becoming the youngest president in American history. Now cut to 1914. That same man, 55 years old, shivering with malarial fever on a rotting canoe. His infected leg swollen to twice its normal size, whispering to his son that they should leave him behind to die in the jungle. Two versions of the same person. One celebrated in every textbook, the other buried in footnotes and fading expedition journals. So why did a man who had already reached the highest office on Earth decide to gamble his life in places most maps still got wrong? The answer rewrites everything you thought you knew about Roosevelt, about conservation, and about the origins of the wild places you've walked through without ever knowing his name was carved into their creation. Most people know Teddy Roosevelt as the Rough Rider, the Trustbuster, the man on Mount Rushmore. What they don't know is that his presidency was an interruption in a lifelong obsession with the natural world. Before he ever sat in the Oval Office, he was a sickly child who built his body through punishing wilderness treks. After he left Washington, he threw himself into expeditions so dangerous that close friends begged him to stop. His wild heart beat louder than political ambition ever did. Roosevelt's love affair with nature began in childhood. Born in 1858 to a wealthy New York family, young Theodore was plagued by debilitating asthma. Doctors told his father the boy might not survive to adulthood. His father's prescription was radical: build the body through sheer will. Roosevelt took it to an extreme. By his teens, he was collecting bird specimens, teaching himself taxidermy, filling notebooks with sketches of wings and beaks and bone structures. He wasn't playing naturalist, he was becoming one. But collecting dead birds in Central Park wasn't enough. In 1883, at age 25, freshly graduated from Harvard and newly married, Roosevelt made a decision that baffled New York society. He bought a cattle ranch in the Dakota Badlands and moved west. His wife and mother had just died on the same day, in the same house. The grief was unbearable. He fled to the frontier, not to escape, but to rebuild himself in the only place that made sense to him: the wild. The Badlands years were Roosevelt's true education. He spent months at a time on horseback, tracking grizzly bears, sleeping under stars, enduring Dakota winters that dropped to 30 below zero. He learned to survive blizzards, to read animal tracks in fresh snow, to move through landscapes where a single mistake could kill you. These weren't vacations, they were tests. And every test he passed made him hungrier for the next one. If channels like this disappeared tomorrow and this was the last time we ever explored history together, would you wish you'd hit subscribe? Hit that button now, because what's coming next takes us from the American West to the African savannah, and then into a jungle so deadly it still carries Roosevelt's name on the map. We've just seen Roosevelt forged in the crucible of the Badlands. Now we're about to watch him take those lessons global. But first, one more American wilderness chapter needs telling. Because before Africa, before the Amazon, Roosevelt helped create the very idea of protected wild land in America. And he did it by walking every inch of it himself. In 1903, President Roosevelt traveled to Yellowstone National Park. Not for a photo opportunity, for a camping trip. He spent 2 weeks in the backcountry with the naturalist John Burroughs, sleeping on pine boughs, waking to frost on his sleeping bag, tracking elk through meadows that few Americans had ever seen. He returned to Washington obsessed with a single idea. If wilderness shaped him, it could shape the nation, but only if that wilderness survived. Between 1901 and 1909, Roosevelt used executive power to protect 230 million acres of American land, 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 51 federal bird reserves, 150 national forests. He didn't do this from a desk. He did it because he'd slept on that ground, drank from those rivers, watched the sun rise over those canyon walls. Every signature he put on a protection order was backed by first-hand experience. That's the difference between policy and conviction. But Roosevelt's appetite for wild places couldn't be satisfied by America alone. By 1909, his presidency was over. He was 50 years old. Most ex-presidents settled into quiet retirement, writing memoirs and giving speeches. Roosevelt booked a ticket to Africa and started planning the largest private expedition the continent had ever seen. His goal: collect specimens for the Smithsonian Institution and satisfy a curiosity that had been burning since childhood. His reputation about to become global. What he was about to do in Africa would either cement his legacy as a scientific pioneer or destroy him as a reckless trophy hunter. The line between the two was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, and Roosevelt was about to walk it for 11 months straight, through terrain that had already killed dozens of white explorers who thought they understood the rules. The Smithsonian Roosevelt African expedition launched in April 1909. The scale was staggering: over 500 porters, dozens of scientists, taxidermists, and guides, tons of equipment, tents, cameras, preserving chemicals, rifles, notebooks, specimen jars. This wasn't a hunting trip, it was a moving museum. Roosevelt had negotiated a deal with the Smithsonian. They'd fund the expedition if he delivered specimens that would fill their halls for decades. He intended to overfill them. The expedition covered British East Africa, now Kenya and Uganda, then pushed west into the Belgian Congo. 11 months, 11,000 specimens, everything from insects to elephants. Roosevelt shot his share of large game: lions, rhinos, buffalo, elephants. But for every animal he killed, his team documented dozens more. They recorded behaviors, mapped migrations, catalogued plant species that Western science had never classified. The notebooks alone filled trunks. Here's the paradox that still divides Roosevelt's biographers. He was both a hunter and a conservationist. He killed elephants and then wrote passionately about protecting elephant populations. He mounted lion heads on his wall and then lobbied for wildlife preserves that banned hunting. It seems contradictory until you understand early 20th century conservation. At the time, many naturalists believed that hunting and preservation could coexist. Sustainable harvest, ethical limits. Roosevelt embodied that contradiction, for better and worse. The African expedition made Roosevelt the most famous living explorer on Earth. When he returned to America in 1910, ticker tape parades met him in New York museums, scrambled to display the specimens. His book, African Game Trails, became a bestseller. But fame and comfort bored him. By 1913, he was planning something far more dangerous. Something that would nearly cost him everything. This wasn't a vacation. It was a moving laboratory, a traveling museum, and a test of how far one man's body and reputation could be pushed. We've followed Roosevelt from Dakota winters to African savannas. Now we're about to enter the expedition that almost erased him from history entirely, the one that still carries his name on the map, the River of Doubt. In 1913, the Brazilian government invited Roosevelt on a lecture tour. He accepted, then pitched a side project. South America's interior held rivers that no scientist had fully mapped. One river in particular, flowing north through the Amazon basin, appeared on maps as a question mark. Indigenous peoples knew it, Portuguese explorers had glimpsed it, but no expedition had ever navigated its full length. It was called the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt. Roosevelt wanted to be the first to map it, name it, and survive it. On February 27, 1914, the Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition launched into the Brazilian wilderness. The team included Roosevelt's son Kermit, Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon, and a small crew of paddlers and porters, 7 dugout canoes. Limited food, no communication with the outside world. They estimated the journey would take a few weeks. It took 2 months, and it nearly killed all of them. The river was a nightmare from day one. Rapids appeared without warning, smashing canoes against rocks. The jungle canopy was so thick that sunlight barely reached the water. Temperatures hovered near 100 degrees. Humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Insects swarmed constantly, mosquitoes, biting flies, ants that could strip flesh in hours. The men slept in soaked clothes, never fully dry, skin rotting from constant moisture. Food ran out faster than planned. They were supposed to hunt and forage, but the jungle offered almost nothing. Game was scarce. Edible plants were hard to identify. They rationed down to starvation levels. A handful of rice, a piece of dried meat, nothing more. Roosevelt, already weakened by old injuries and a sedentary post-presidency, began losing weight rapidly. His famous energy drained away week by week. Then the river took its first life. A canoe overturned in rapids. One of the Brazilian paddlers, Simplicio, drowned in the current. The team spent hours trying to recover the body they failed. Roosevelt wrote in his journal that night that the river had claimed its price and would likely claim more before they reached civilization. He was right. A few days later, Roosevelt gashed his leg on a submerged rock. In the jungle's filth, infection set in immediately. His leg swelled. Fever followed. He was burning up, shaking with chills, barely able to stand. Kermit and Rondon tried to treat the wound, but they had almost no medical supplies. Roosevelt's condition worsened. Abscesses formed, the infection spread. At night, delirious with fever, Roosevelt recited poetry to himself. One poem, over and over, Coleridge's Kubla Khan. The team could hear him muttering in the dark, half-conscious, losing his grip on the present. He told Kermit to leave him behind. "I'm only a burden now, you'll move faster without me." Kermit refused. He told his father they'd carry him out or die trying. As his weight dropped, the river narrowed and the dangers multiplied. Roosevelt wasn't sure he'd ever see his family again. And for a moment, neither were the men beside him. The expedition had turned into a survival ordeal, no longer about science or discovery, just about making it out alive. By the time they reached the telegraph station at the river's end, Roosevelt had lost 57 pounds. His infected leg left him limping for the rest of his life. He would suffer recurring fevers and health complications from that jungle infection until his death 5 years later in 1919. Some biographers argue the River of Doubt killed him slowly, that the expedition shortened his life by years. Roosevelt himself said it took 10 years off him in 2 months, but he also said it was worth it. The river was mapped, the expedition collected new species, and the Rio de Duvida was officially renamed Rio Roosevelt. His name, permanently carved into the Amazon basin. A river that almost killed him became his monument. If this is the kind of deep dive into history that you never see on TV or in classrooms, hit the like button right now. Because we're about to connect Roosevelt's near-death experience to something you interact with constantly. The national parks you visit, the wildlife documentaries you watch, the entire modern idea of wilderness conservation. It all traces back to decisions made by a man who knew, from personal suffering, what wildness actually costs. We've watched Roosevelt survive the River of Doubt. Barely. Now let's talk about what he did with that survival. Because the expeditions weren't just personal adventures, they were the raw material for a conservation revolution that changed the planet. Every time you step into a national park or watch a nature documentary, you're walking in the echo of choices he made far from Washington. Choices grounded in first-hand knowledge of what wilderness is, what it requires, and why it matters. Roosevelt didn't protect land because it was pretty. He protected it because he'd almost died in places like it and understood that those experiences, that wildness, was vanishing. Roosevelt's conservation legacy is staggering in numbers alone. During his presidency, he established or expanded 5 national parks: Crater Lake, Wind Cave, Sully's Hill, Mesa Verde, and Platte. He created the first 51 federal bird preserves, protecting species like pelicans, egrets, and herons from the feather trade that was driving them toward extinction. He designated 18 national monuments, including the Grand Canyon, which he personally visited on a 1903 camping trip and called the one great sight every American should see. But the numbers don't capture the philosophy. Roosevelt believed that wilderness wasn't a luxury for the rich or a resource to exploit without limits. It was a national inheritance. He spoke about it in almost spiritual terms. He wrote that the American landscape shaped American character, that losing the wild meant losing something essential about who Americans were. He was speaking from experience. The Badlands rebuilt him. Yellowstone clarified his purpose. Africa tested his limits. The Amazon nearly killed him. He wasn't theorizing, he was testifying. His post-presidency writings spread that testimony globally. Through the Brazilian Wilderness, published in 1914, became an international bestseller. It wasn't just an adventure story, it was a detailed account of Amazonian ecology, indigenous cultures, and the fragility of ecosystems under pressure from logging and settlement. Roosevelt used his celebrity to argue for protected reserves, not just in America, but everywhere. His voice carried weight. World leaders listened. By the 1910s, Roosevelt's ideas about conservation had influenced policy across Europe, Africa, and South America. National park systems, modeled on the American example, began appearing in other countries. Wildlife protection treaties started referencing his speeches. The concept of sustainable use, balancing human needs with ecological preservation, became mainstream partly because Roosevelt had lived both sides, the hunter who killed and the protector who legislated. Most Roosevelt biographers now agree that his exploration years were inseparable from his political legacy. You can't understand his environmental policies without understanding the grizzly he tracked in the Badlands, the elephants he studied in Africa, or the infection that nearly killed him in the Amazon. The policies emerged from the experiences, not the other way around. He governed like an explorer, curious, bold, willing to take risks for long-term gains. But arguments about whether Roosevelt was a hero or a complicated figure with serious flaws have never fully ended. He was an imperialist who believed in American expansion. He was a hunter in an era when hunting wasn't yet understood as ecologically destructive. He romanticized the strenuous life in ways that ignored privilege and excluded marginalized communities from accessing the wilderness he protected. His conservation was real, but it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't for everyone. Still, the land he saved remains. The parks are still there. The forests still grow. The rivers still flow, mostly through systems he helped establish. You can argue about Roosevelt's motives, his blind spots, his contradictions. But you can't argue with the acreage, 230 million acres. That's an area larger than Texas and California combined, protected in 8 years by a man who knew what wildness felt like because he'd bled into it. Tell us in the comments, which Roosevelt expedition would you have joined and which one would have broken you? Because we're about to close this story by asking why his explorer identity got buried by history and what it means that we're rediscovering it now. We've traced Roosevelt from the Oval Office to the River of Doubt and back again. We've seen the hunter, the scientist, the conservationist, and the reckless adventurer. Now let's talk about why this side of his story almost disappeared and why it matters that you're hearing it today. For decades after Roosevelt's death in 1919, history focused on his presidency. Textbooks taught the Square Deal, the Panama Canal, the trust-busting museums displayed his Rough Rider hat and Nobel Peace Prize. His face was carved into Mount Rushmore in 1927, frozen in presidential granite. The explorer was forgotten. The expeditions became footnotes. The Amazon fever, the African specimens, the conservation philosophy born from personal risk, all of it faded into specialized biography sections that most people never read. Why? Partly because exploration itself fell out of favor. By the mid-20th century, the age of great white explorers looked embarrassing. Colonial extraction, trophy hunting, the romanticization of conquering indigenous lands, all of it became politically uncomfortable. Roosevelt's expeditions, especially the African safari, were tied to that history, easier to ignore them than to reckon with them. But ignoring them erased something important. It erased the fact that Roosevelt's conservation policies didn't come from abstract political philosophy. They came from a man who had walked through ecosystems, documented species, survived injuries, and watched landscapes change under human pressure. His policies had teeth because he'd seen the teeth. The predators, the rivers, the jungles. He wasn't guessing, he was remembering. In recent years, historians have started reclaiming this narrative. New biographies emphasize the expeditions. Documentaries explore the River of Doubt conservation organizations, invoke Roosevelt's wilderness experiences as the origin story for modern environmentalism. The man on Rushmore is being recontextualized as the man on the canoe, on the horse, in the tent, bleeding into a jungle riverbank and deciding that places like that were worth saving. That reclamation matters to you. If you've ever visited Yellowstone, stood at the Grand Canyon, hiked through a national forest, or watched a documentary about endangered species, You've interacted with the legacy of a man who knew what it felt like to almost die in the wild. His policies weren't theoretical, they were survival instincts translated into law. Roosevelt's legacy is also embedded in the modern culture of adventure. The rise of wilderness tourism, the popularity of extreme expeditions, the romanticization of finding yourself in nature, all of it echoes his strenuous life philosophy, for better and worse. It can inspire people to connect with the natural world. It can also perpetuate the idea that wilderness is a playground for the privileged, a space where only the tough belong. Roosevelt believed both things at once. His contradictions are still playing out in our culture. So what do we do with Theodore Roosevelt in 2025? We acknowledge all of it. The visionary conservationist who saved millions of acres, the imperialist who believed some cultures were superior to others, the scientist who advanced ecology, the hunter who killed for sport, the father who nearly abandoned his son to die in a jungle, the leader who inspired generations to protect wild places. He was all of those things. Rejecting the complexity doesn't make him clearer, it just makes him less real. What remains inarguable is the land. The parks he fought for still exist. The species he helped protect still fly, swim, and run through ecosystems that were almost destroyed. When you walk into those spaces, you're walking through the consequences of his choices, the good ones and the complicated ones. That's history, not myth, not hero worship, just the messy, contradictory, undeniable record of a man who refused to stay in the Oval Office when the world outside was still wild enough to kill him. If this kind of long-form, nuanced history is something you want to see more of, subscribe now. Because channels that tell complex stories without flattening them into easy heroes or villains are rare, and if they disappeared tomorrow, we'd lose the chance to understand history as it actually was. Wild, dangerous, contradictory, and absolutely worth remembering. Most history books leave this part in the footnotes. You've now walked the trails he risked everything to follow. You've seen the fever dreams, the infected leg, the river that carries his name, and the parklands that carry his legacy. You know a version of Theodore Roosevelt that most people will never encounter. A man who was more than a president. He was an explorer who bled into the wilderness and then spent the rest of his life making sure that wilderness would outlive him. So here's the final question, the one Roosevelt never fully answered himself. Was he preserving nature for future generations, or was he preserving the idea of the frontier, the adventure, the test, the place where men could still prove themselves against something bigger than politics? Maybe both. Maybe the distinction doesn't matter as much as the outcome. The land is still there, the rivers still flow, and somewhere in the Amazon, a river still bears the name of the man who almost died mapping it. That's the secret life of Theodore Roosevelt. Not the one on Mount Rushmore, the one in the jungle, the one that history almost forgot, the one you'll never forget now.